Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Castleberry. I am one of the financial planners with Investment Planning Advisors. We partner with the county to offer individual financial planning services. One of the parts of that, other than meeting with individuals individually and building out personalized retirement plans, investment strategies to really make sure you're optimizing everything you have available to you, is also providing these presentations. So this one for this month is going to be year-end planning. Again, these are posted on our site and our video library. You can reach out to the benefits team to find a link to that, or you can go to our website, investmentadvise.com, and go to our video library, and all of our past presentations and other informational videos are posted there. But we're going to be talking about year-end planning today. Year-end planning being obviously things you would do at year end to wrap up your financial life, to wrap up kind of everything that was covered over this last year, but also to start getting ready for next year. Now, ideally, if you've never done any sort of year-end planning before and you've always just kind of flown by the seat of your pants, this can be a little bit daunting, at least for the first year or maybe two, just because it is a lot of information to cover and kind of check off. But once you get in the habit of this and the rhythm, it becomes very, very easy, because a lot of these things that we'll talk about today aren't necessarily something that takes a lot of legwork every single year, but they're things that you can just check on and say, hey, if nothing's changed from this year to last year, good, perfect, we can go ahead and move forward. And then again, just setting yourself up for success for the next year so you can continue to better your long-term outlook and better your financial health year by year. So we're going to break this down into a few different sections. So starting off, we're going to be looking at budgeting and spending. So really that very microscopic level of your financial life. So your internal household budgeting and spending. Then we're going to go into retirement, go into insurance review, go into taxes, and then finally wrap up with estate and estate planning at that point. So first off, budgeting and spending. So first thing you want to do is kind of review budgeting and spending, is gather your financial records, categorize your spending, and compare your spending to your budget. So when we talk about gathering records, you want to gather mortgage, last mortgage statement, maybe last year's tax return, if you have pay stubs, if you've given to charity, any sort of records that are going to be useful. Some of these will be useful for your taxes, but they're all going to be useful just to kind of get a decent idea of where your spending's going. If you do budget, kind of getting that at least up to date at that point, looking through your spendings for the prior year. So ideally, a lot of these are going to be regular month-to-month spendings, but if you had anything over the past year that really surprised you, so an unexpected emergency, or a trip that was more expensive than you planned for, got 4 flat tires, who knows, whatever it might have been that could have been a larger surprise, you want to make sure you're kind of gathering those up, because that's going to come into a play when you start to look at kind of comparing your spending with your budget and trying to set yourself up for next year. Because when you go into this third step of comparing your spending to your budget, well, if you budgeted XYZ but you end up spending more, one, is your budget realistic for you? Two, but also, if you had these larger one-off expenses at any point in time, are you actually planning for those, or are those just perpetually something that pushes you back or prohibits you from kind of completing a goal? So when you're looking into the next year, one of the things you want to look at when you're gathering these financial records is start keeping track of major purchases or major repairs. So when I say major purchases or major repairs, think of things like when you start to plan for next year, how old's your AC unit? How old's your hot water heater? When's the last time you had them serviced? How old are your appliances? How old's your car? Are you planning on any home improvements? Are you planning on having kids? Are those kids going into sports next year? Will there be higher expenses associated with that? Are you planning a vacation? You want to start kind of not just looking backwards at what you've spent, being like, man, I wish I'd better prepared for that, but actually starting to prepare. So part of this reviewing budget and spending is really reviewing, all right, what are your spending goals for next year? How can you start to get ahead? And that might be setting a little bit aside every month for an emergency savings. That might be setting a little bit aside every month specifically for like AC repair, for home improvements, for vacation, for kids spending, whatever that might be, but getting in the habit of starting to always look forward and say, all right, well, we want to do this and this next year. How do we fund that so that we don't get there and we kind of roughly say, all right, well, we planned for this vacation, but it's more expensive than we thought. And we didn't really plan around it. So it's going on a credit card, and then you're looking at debt. And we'll get to debt in a second. But what you're ultimately trying to do is make sure you can set yourself up by looking at this last year, seeing where maybe some weaknesses were, some pain points, and addressing those. There's always going to be something that comes up every year that you're not going to plan on, or you're not going to know about, or you're not going to expect. But ideally, as you do this year after year after year after year, one, it becomes a lot less daunting because you'll already have a system in place. But two, those things that are surprises either become a lot smaller or they become they're just as big, but they become much smaller issues because you already have kind of built-in savings for those. Next, you want to look at maximizing your cash return. And I say that because when it comes to budgeting and spending, usually that's going to be the category of where you start talking about, well, how much do we have in savings? And one of the great things now with interest rates being as high as they are, it has trade-offs like anything else, but you can get a significantly higher yield on your cash than you would have 2 years ago, 1 year ago. At that point. So, you can get a high interest savings account that's paying 4.5, 4.8%, as opposed to keeping it maybe in like a traditional brick and mortar, like a Bank of America or a Wells Fargo savings account that's only going to pay you maybe 0.1 to 0.3 to 0.5. So low hanging fruit, make sure you're getting the most you can out of your cash savings, especially in a time right now where you can do that without taking on any risk. You can still stay in a savings or a money market account, so you still have liquidity. You don't have to lock it up into a CD, and be able to really receive a good return on those funds. Next is going to be review your debts. So you want to review your debts and kind of look and say, all right, what does my debt picture look like? How much debt do I have? What's my monthly debt to income ratio? So make a list of all your debts. This includes anything that's owed to you or owed that you pay interest on a monthly basis. Don't consider like utilities or anything. This is going to be something where you would slowly pay it off at that point. And you want to create a plan for that debt. So there's really two avenues that you can kind of think about as far as debt snowball and debt avalanche. We'll get to that in a second, but when you're making a list of your debt, I tend to like to say make two lists. One is a list of unsecured debts and one is a list of secured debts. So a secured debt has an asset that's backing it. So a mortgage or a car. An unsecured debt is going to be a credit card or a personal loan typically. So there's not a clear asset that is really backing that debt. So if you sell your house, ideally the profits from that would cover what you had left on the mortgage. Sell your car, it could go towards the car payment depending on if it's depreciated or not depreciated. I do apologize. And I apologize. It's not that I'm tired. It's when I talk this much. I tend to talk very quickly and get myself out of breath, which then in turn causes me to yawn, which is I should probably work on as far as giving presentations. But that being said, so an unsecured debt is going to be a type of debt where you are really looking at essentially something that you can't point to a specific asset that backs it. So technically a credit card did purchase items, but if it purchased a hamburger for you, you can't look at that hamburger that you've probably eaten and passed through by this point and say, oh, well, I'll just sell that hamburger. Or if it's a piece of furniture or whatever it might be, you typically can't sell those to cover that loan. Two, unsecured debts, specifically with credit cards, are things that can accumulate. So it's not going to be set to a fixed dollar. Like a personal loan set and like a mortgage is set and like a car payment is set. But like a credit card, if you put $1,000 on there, but you pay the minimum, well, that balance can balloon with that credit card rate. And what we're finding now is credit card rates are getting up close to almost 30%, which is an astronomical number and is astronomically difficult to get out from under it. So when you're looking at this, you really want to make sure you know where your debts are, and then you want to take a stance of how do I attack these going into next year. And that's where the debt avalanche and the debt snowball come into play. So the debt avalanche, for all intents and purposes, is you look at the highest interest rate and you attack that one first, and then you go to the next highest interest rate and the next highest interest rate and the next highest interest rate. The debt snowball is you prioritize balances over interest rates. So there's two schools of thought. So like a lot of times on paper, the debt avalanche would look better than the debt snowball because you're not paying as much in interest over time, and it can be a little bit more like mathematically sound in some cases. However, the debt snowball can be a little bit better for actually getting the debt paid off, like a motivational side of things. So I tend to like look at it in this. So first off, let's look at which debts are we really attacking first. So if you have car, mortgage, personal loan, credit card first, personal loan second, car third, mortgage last. And mortgages would be an argument of mortgage or invest. So it's a whole different story, but you want to get the unsecured debts first and then prioritize probably the credit cards. At that point, they're going to have the higher interest rate and they're going to have the ability to potentially balloon on you. So that's going to be right off the bat. And then once you're looking at those credit cards, if you just have one credit card, perfect. It makes this snowball avalanche easy because it's just a one option and you pay it off. Now, if you have multiple credit cards, that's where you start to really have to weigh the pros and cons of the avalanche via the snowball at that point. So I always kind of view it this way. If you have 3 credit cards and they are roughly the same balance, so let's say they're all within a few $100s of each other. So like a $6,000, a $6,200, and a $6,500. So not a huge difference between the 3. Look at the interest rate and pay the one with the highest interest rate off first. I would do that and then work your way down. Now, if you have 3 credit cards, but they're very different balances, say you have a $10,000, a $6,000, and a $3,000, I would shoot for the $3,000 one first because that's going to get you a little bit of momentum. If the $3,000 is technically the lowest interest rate and the highest interest rate is the $10,000, well, you would do the 10 first. But what happens a lot of times is if you're paying off that bigger one, it's not necessarily hurting you, but if it takes you a year to 2 years to pay off that big one, a lot of times the excitement and the kind of, I don't want to say thrill of paying it off, but the motivation to pay it off starts to wane over time. This is where the snowball can be a little bit more like beneficial, I think, from just an internal motivation kind of psychological standpoint, where you see that $3,000 get paid off and you feel like you're making a lot of momentum because you're seeing one of those payments drop off at that point. Whereas in the same amount of time, you could have gotten $3,000 knocked off of $10,000, but you're still seeing 3 payments. So it might be a matter of where the motivation, it works for you. But if you do need that, like, hey, I need to feel like I'm really moving something, that's where the debt snowball comes into play. So then I would say debt snowball the $3,000. Then I would come to the argument of, all right, well, maybe if the interest rate on the $10,000 is a lot higher than the 6, shoot for the 10 because they are a little bit closer. If it's like a $6,000, $7,000, definitely go interest rate. But if it's like a $3,600, a $6,000, and like a $30,000 credit card, I would argue maybe do the 6 and the 3 at that point and knock those off first because they're going to be faster. And then that $30,000 is going to be the longer one, but you roll those payments into that. That's really ideally just getting to where you can give yourself some motivation. Part of it's knowing yourself, knowing what's going to drive you to do a little bit better at that point, but that's where we sit. Next is going to be retirement. So first off, adjust your 401k and 457 contributions for the upcoming year. So usually, and it's not every year, but in most years, you'll see the IRS will come out and they will increase the contribution limits to a 401k, a 457, an IRA, a Roth IRA. So you want to make sure you're adjusting accordingly just to kind of keep pace with that inflationary adjustment. But also you want to make sure you're adjusting to give your retirement a little bit better outlook. So even if you're doing 1% a year, that is a pretty dramatic increase. So like this is 3 examples of like 3 different people. So if we have Susie, who's 35, she earns $60,000 a year. Well, if she increases her retirement by 1%, it's roughly like $12 a week, but it gives her an extra $85,000 in retirement. Now, this is subject to investment returns and a lot, but this is a very, very bare bones, very oversimplified means, but I think it does a great job of proving the point at this point. So if we have a 45-year-old earns $70,000, extra 1% is roughly $14 a week, so they're not going to miss it that much is the point. And then it gives them an extra $42,000. And even someone that's 55 earning 80,000. So those higher earning years, that's $16,000 extra for roughly $16 a week at that point in time. So you want to make sure you are giving your 401k and your 457, especially if you're with the county, that bump at that point. And you want to make sure you're doing that partly because you don't want your lifestyle creep to outpace what you'd set as your retirement goal. So someone might say, and I'll kind of do this, is you might say, I live on $5,000 a month. I plan and build a retirement strategy around me living on $5,000 a month. Maybe you did that when you were 38. And that was fine because you lived on $5,000 a month. You took inflation into account. So when you're 60, it's going to be the equivalent of $5,000 at age 60 as it is at age 38. However, you got cost of living adjustments between 38 and 60. So now you get cost of living every year, maybe get some raises in there, some salary increases in there. So now we get to say 50-50 and your regular baseline living expenses are $6,200. Well, now, and you never updated your 401k contributions, you never updated your plan. Well, we based everything on 5,000 being 5,000 in retirement. So like that 5,000 and inflating up. But now, if you were to spend the equivalent of 5,000 at 38 in retirement, you're having to take a pretty big step back on what your regular day-to-day lifestyle has become accustomed to. So to kind of combat that is you get a cost of living every year. So say you get a 2% cost of living, give 1% to your 401k, 1% to yourself. It's a 3%, 4%, 1% to your 401k, 2, 3, 4% to yourself, whatever that might be. But make sure you're giving yourself and your retirement, your future self, a raise so you are keeping pace with what your cost of living adjustment might come to. Next, you want to evaluate your contribution type. So where are you contributing to? And when you do that, you want to ask yourself a couple questions because you want to say, all right, how am I contributing from a tax standpoint? Do I want to do Roth? Do I want to do pre-tax? And if you are curious about the difference, we have a few presentations on the difference between those two, on what the tax ramifications are. I encourage you to go back and look at those. But you want to ask yourself questions on that. You want to ask yourself some questions on the match and how old you are. So let's start off and say, all right, have you reached the 401k match? So if you're working with the county specifically, you get a match in your 401k. You do not get a match if you contribute to your 457B. So you want to make sure you have maximized the 401k max that you have available to you. That schedule is here. It's in your benefits guide. It's gone over in the new hire. You can find it in your old emails on that PowerPoint. But what it essentially says, it's a fairly little bit more complex, but it is very, very generous. Once you've hit 6 months, if you put in 5%, the county will match that 5%. So you put in 5, they put in 5, you get 10% going in. From 1 year to 5 years, you put in 5, they put in 5, but they also put in an additional flat seed, a 5% seed. That goes in whether you contribute or not, but to get the full match, you have to put in 5. From 5 years to 10 years, that match goes up, so that 5% seed is still there. The 5% match on your first 5% is still there. But if you increase your match up to 10%, they will put in another 2.5. So years 5 through 10, if you put in 5, they put in 12.5. And then at year 10, you put in 10, they put in 15. So years, essentially 6 months through 5, to get the most out of your max, you need to put in 5. From years 5 to 10 and on, to get the most out of your match, you need to put in 10 at that point. So you want to make sure you're at least getting the most free money you possibly can. That's going to be the first question you have to ask yourself. When you decide, hey, I'm increasing this by 1%, how do I get the most out of it? First off, am I maxing out my 401k match? If the answer is yes to that, then you can go to the next question. If the answer is no, I have not maxed out my 401k match, put it in your 401k and max out the 401k match. Period. That's it. You can re-ask yourself these questions next year. Now, if you can answer yes to that, then the next question is, all right, what's your total household income? And you want to do this because it's going to matter based on how much you pay in taxes today and how much you're thinking you're going to pay in taxes in the future. So if you are in a higher tax bracket today, I'm saying higher, like think 24 or above. So your marginal tax bracket's 24. You're probably going to have a lower tax rate in retirement. So there's a pretty decent argument that you want to continue to add to your 401k. If you have a lower tax bracket, so you're like 22 or below, there's a fairly decent argument that it's probably going to be about equal, or tax in retirement might be a little bit higher on like a effective rate. So you want to go Roth. So that's the first question. These next two kind of like they blend together. So what's your total household income? So you want to say, all right, well, if it's kind of in that mid-range, then you're thinking, all right, well, then the question becomes, how old are you? Because it's not just, are you going to be in a higher or lower tax rate in retirement, but also how much time do you have prior to that retirement? So if we look at this, it's kind of a similar chart where you see someone's income growing over time, and then they retire and their taxable income in retirement is much lower. So if you are in really, I'd say your 30s and you've already maxed out your match, put it in the Roth 457B. Hands down, do that. If you're in your 40s and you're getting to the point where you're hitting your higher earning years, you're in those higher tax brackets, there's a pretty decent argument that tax level is going to be much higher than you'll see in retirement. So you're probably going to want to put money into the 401k. If you're kind of a mid-range here, so that 22% tax bracket, which is pretty wide as of right now, and this will be subject to change as tax brackets change, and you're in your 40s, I would probably say put into the Roth, because you're already doing pre-tax into the 401k. So the Roth would just be in addition to that. But that's what you want to kind of think about. You want to ask yourself those three questions. Again, if you can answer the first one as yes, I have reached the max of my 401k match, then you look at the next two questions kind of together, combined, and say, all right, what's my income? How old am I? Should I continue with 401k, or should I start adding into the 457B at that point, and the Roth 457B available to you? Next, you want to review your insurance plan. So you want to shop around for best rates. So car insurance, homeowners insurance, you want to kind of shop around year to year and just see. It's a little bit of a nuisance, and it's one of those things, if you're fine with your rate, you're fine with your provider, you have a multi-line discount, you don't have to shop around. But if you're the type of person that really likes to get the deal, shopping around might be something for you. You want to make sure you have the right coverage. So you want to kind of at least have a discussion with maybe your insurance provider every year, specifically on like homeowners insurance or liability insurance on car insurance. Like if you're having a child starting to drive, or if you made a big home improvement, is your homeowners insurance policy going to cover that? Do you have enough liability insurance between your homeowners and your car insurance? Specifically with home, you want to review, do you have actual cash value or replacement cash value? If you remember back to our insurance presentation, replacement value replaces it, whereas actual value subtracts age, wear, and tear. So you just want to be clear on what you actually have, what your premium's actually paying for, and again, make sure you're letting them know of any major improvements, because your rate's affected by a lot of things, but coverage options is a big one, and then condition of your home and kind of what your valuation. So really over the last few years too, as home prices have really skyrocketed, if you were in a neighborhood that's seen a lot of appreciation, you might want to really double check, hey, is my homeowner's insurance policy going to cover everything if I get a house fire and need to replace all of this? The other thing you want to look at is life insurance. So I believe you guys just wrapped up open enrollment, or might be wrapping it up fairly soon at this point. But you want to look at life insurance coverage, what your need is. So if you're just starting to have a family, it might be time to buy a term policy, get a term policy to cover your family if something were to happen to you, or if you were close to retirement and your assets are getting high enough to where maybe it might be time to actually drop a policy and you can self-insure yourself. But you want to review that and just make sure you have enough coverage for where your life is today, and just make sure you are properly doing that. If it's needing to buy up a little bit more from the county, or needing to get an extra term policy outside of the county, look at doing that. Next is going to be year-end tax preparation. So year-end tax preparation, so a lot of it's just, If you're doing your own taxes, make sure you're using a software that can help you with the deductions and tax credits you may be eligible for. A lot of these are really complex, and a lot of these have a lot of kind of fine details in them. So just make sure you're looking into that and trying to get the most out of that. Make adjustments to your withholdings and your estimated tax payments. So I always say, like, if you've had a kid or kids have started to no longer be considered dependents, you want to make sure you're updating your withholding. We've had several cases where they weren't updated and they ended up having a big tax burden when they didn't qualify for certain child credits anymore, but they were still withholding like they had children that were dependents. So you just want to make sure you're taking into account that. If you have a spouse that's a small business owner, make sure you're looking at income, making quarterly tax payments, and paying at least 90% of prior year's tax throughout the year so you can avoid a penalty at that point. If you had a large tax bill, or you just weren't sure why you had a tax bill, see if you need to update your withholdings to hold a little bit more each paycheck or pay quarterly just to cover that. It's happened pretty across the board. The IRS has had a few weird instances over the last few years where companies have underwithheld by accident. So it's one of those things. Just make sure you're planning for that. And again, reviewing last year's tax returns, see what your income was last year, see what your total tax last year was. And just on your pay stubs, make sure you're tracking to where if you got an increase, you're saving enough to not get a surprise. And that goes into gathering tax documents. Anything that's going to be able to be gathered before January, I would try to do that. So you're really just waiting on 1099s or W-2s from employers or investment accounts so you can go ahead and file in a timely manner to try and get that wrapped up prior to the April deadline for most people, or so you don't have to file an extension and really just extend that. And that way too, you know, if you do owe anything, you can start to really plan on it, and it's not something where you're going to be so far behind. You're going to start trying to pay on last year's as you're filing this year's at that point. You also want to make sure you are taking into account, like with those documents, any medical expenses, business expenses, charitable deductions you might be doing. So if you gave stuff to Goodwill in January, make sure you keep track of that so you can use it on your return come the end of the year. Finally, wrapping up with year-end estate planning. So you want to review your will, any trust documents, if you have those. If you don't have those, we'll kind of talk about them. But if you do have those, review it. If anything's changed with a guardian, you want to make sure your beneficiaries are still kind of where they would need to be if something were to happen to you. And I would say this is an example, like if you had your kids going to a sister and brother-in-law or brother and sister-in-law, but then they got divorced last year, and now you don't want them going to them at that point, like they might be a wreck. So you need to update your will to where if something were to happen to you, they're not just going to push and you're now single brother or sister at that point in time. Or if they were going to your parents, but one of your parents passed away and the other one maybe wouldn't be physically able to, you want to make sure you're updating that. Updating beneficiary designations. So if you do get divorced or you get married or you change your name or the person you had as a beneficiary passes away, make sure you're going through your accounts and updating beneficiaries on brokerage accounts, IRA accounts, life insurance policies. Build a digital estate plan, or at least update a digital estate plan. This is going to be things like social media accounts, email accounts, photo, like cloud logins at this point. So this has become something that's a little bit more relevant, I think, in the last maybe decade, where it used to, like if you were trying to find old photos, you could more likely go to like a basement or an attic or a crawl space and they'd be in a box somewhere. But now it's on either Apple, Google, or Microsoft's cloud probably. So make sure you have logins for that. Make sure you have logins to written down. So if something were to happen to you, your loved ones can go close your social media accounts, kind of wrap everything up nicely so there's not just random information out there for you. Close your email accounts. Make sure they can get any photos that you had saved or wanted access to. But things along those lines, so like YouTube Music account or Spotify account or anything that might have a recurring payment that they're trying to like wrap up at that point. So just make sure you have that taken in. Now, if you don't have beneficiaries or a will or anything done, for a beneficiary, kind of for most people, you can put it on retirement accounts, so your 401ks, your IRAs, your 457s, life insurance policies. Most people know those. You do have a transfer on death or a payable on death. That can typically be applied to like bank accounts or brokerage accounts. Those are really nice because if you have a beneficiary on these, they can avoid the probate process, which is nice because it can go directly to the individual you want the funds to go to without having to sit through a possibly expensive, possibly headache-ridden, possibly long probate process. If you don't have a will done, there's really three kinds. So you have essentially with holographic the written will. So if you handwrite your will, that's very, very infrequent nowadays. You have the DIYs, which are a lot more common. That's like if you use Vanilla or Trust and Will, an online, or LegalZoom, like an online will service that you would just need to get notarized and witnessed, or if you have a lawyer draft a will at that point. So that would be something where you actually went to an attorney and you had them draft up a will for you. But again, if you don't have a will, get one done. You can get a DIY one done through the EAP with the county at that point. So I would recommend that. As you're doing it, things to think about: who you want the executor to be. So that's who carries out the will. Witnesses and beneficiaries. Witnesses are pretty standard. Testator is going to be you. Guardians, so who will be guardian of your children. Those are really executor and guardianship are the two big ones. Beneficiaries are kind of the beneficiaries. They're going to be who gets the stuff. But who carries out and who is guardians, you want to make sure you're thinking about that. And again, make sure you're updating those on an annual basis. But that wraps up everything I had for today. So really, with a year end, I mean, you're not looking at necessarily a ton of stuff. Probably the biggest burden, if you've never done it before, is going to be the budgeting side of things and really starting to track your expenses. But once you get to the year-end tax, once you get to the estate plan, once you get to the insurance review, a lot of those don't change that much year to year. So ideally, you can get through a lot of those as just check, I reviewed this, I reviewed this, I reviewed this, I reviewed this, and it's a pretty simple path for you at that point that doesn't take a lot of time. So really, you're maybe committing a weekend out of the year towards the end of the year to try and wrap things up to make sure you are setting yourself up for success going forward. Now, if you would like to meet with us, please reach out to my email here if you're with the county, or reach me at this number. We can set off a one-on-one meeting to set up a plan and kind of go through our process of finding out where you sit financially, where you're kind of tracking towards, and what you need to be doing in order to hit really financial success going into the rest of your career, but also into retirement. For Forsyth County employees, all of our costs are covered by the county, so don't have to worry about anything there. But feel free to reach out, and we can get something set up for you. But I appreciate the presentation, and again, check our other videos on all of our past presentations, and for our future ones, we'll be posting them up here as well. And have a great day.